One of the banes of my existence as a YouTuber talking about old movies and King Kong and stuff like that is that I don't live anywhere. I live in Calgary in the western end of the Canadian plains. There's nothing going on, at least as far as a lot of those Hollywood connections, the golden age of Hollywood, classic Hollywood. But there is one thing, one connection at least, that I can make, which is to the birthplace of Fay Wray, which is where I'm at today, in the town of Cardston, Alberta, and very, very southern Alberta, maybe like 20 minutes north of the US border. And this is the closest town to where Fay Wray was born. She was actually born about 25 miles out of town at her family's ranch, and we're gonna actually go see if we can get as close to it as we can. It is on private land. I wasn't able to get in touch with the landowner, but we'll get as close as we can into some significant places in the early life of Fay Wray. Now, Fay was born in 1907 on her family's ranch outside of the town of Cardston here, to parents who they met in Salt Lake City. I think they were technically Mormon, but Vina Fay Wray, born 1907, was not herself ever baptized in the Mormon church. And Cardston itself is a primarily Mormon community, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's also a dry town. There, you can't get alcohol here. It's because of Mormon prohibitions against alcohol. But we're gonna see if we can track down some of, at least get as close as we can to those sites related to her. She did spend some time here in town, but not a whole lot, and not very much to her recollections. If I have her autobiography here, her family left Cardston and the southern Alberta area when she was 3 years old. So most of her memories are actually of things that were told to her. It's her mother's memories, her family's memories that she was told secondhand.
When I was 3 years old, there was so much talk about Canada, particularly from my mother, and the beauty of it, and the flowers that grew in the wild, and wild strawberries up there where I was born, and so I felt that we had left an enchanted land.
She does have a few memories she talks about in here, and among those are that after her mother had a nervous breakdown because she and one of her brothers had actually fallen into a frozen lake, her mother was sent off to Brandon, Manitoba, which is quite a ways away. It's on the eastern side of the Canadian prairies. She was sent to live here in town with the Stackpool family. Dr. Stackpool is the town physician and pharmacist, and so she was sent to live with their family in what was considered one of the nicest homes, one of the nicest estates here in the town of Cardston. But trucks going by. As a 3-year-old child, not a whole lot of memories of her own. Most of what she talks about in her autobiography is actually her return visit here to Cardston in 1962, when the fountain behind me here was first dedicated to the 75th anniversary of the town of Cardston, and their most famous daughter was invited back to be a guest of honor here, and to have this fountain dedicated to her, and to make some speeches about, again, not so much the memory she had of Cardston, but of what Cardston meant to her family, to her parents, and to celebrate her own original roots here in Cardston and in southern Alberta, and to return to them. Now, so this fountain, the Fay Wray Fountain here, was first dedicated in 1962, but by the 1990s had fallen into some disrepair. But in 1993, they restored it, and Fay came back in 1993 to rededicate the fountain. And the big sign here behind me with King Kong was unveiled in 1993 at those ceremonies. That was after her book was published, so she was signing copies of her book. They had a showing of King Kong here in the theater. but a lot of what she talks about here in her book is actually her memories of those events, as the 62, when she came here in 1962, and using that as the framework to talk about the memories that the few memories she had when she was 3, and the memories passed down by her mother and her family. So we're gonna take a look. We're gonna talk about the town of Cardston. What is this town? How did it start? And we're gonna go over to the homestead of Charles Ora Card, who was the member, I'm not sure if he was an elder, but at least member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who was commissioned to come up here into Canada and to start a Mormon community up here. He was also fleeing polygamy charges in the United States, came up here and to go visit the Mormon temple that was eventually built, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. And then we're going to head out and we're going to get as close as we can, again, to the original Wray homestead. So now we're at the home of Charles Ora Card, and we're here with
Peyton Oliver.
Peyton Oliver is going to tell us a bit about how Cardston was founded and who founded it and whose cabin this is and that sort of thing. So can you tell us a bit about Cardston?
Yeah, so Charles came up here with, I think it was just him at the time. But he came up here and he just wanted to get away from, like, I think it was polygamy, because it was frowned upon in the States, and he had a few wives himself, so he wanted to come up here. And they actually wanted to settle some like LDS people up in Canada. So he came here, and originally I think he went up to Calgary and then through BC, and then he went back home and he didn't find anything there. So, and then he came back here again, and then he found Cardston, which was near, which is Lee's Creek now, but and he thought it was like a really nice place, so he settled here. And at the time they lived in tents, so they lived by Lions Park, just like on the other side of town, kind of. But and then they came here and built this house in 1887, and it was just like a small house at the time, because everyone in Cardston, there were about 10 families at the time that came up after, and so they all had to have like a small, somewhat house, and then they could add on to it. So yeah, and he was just solid foundation to start LDS people coming up, and just to have a build a temple. Well, he actually left Cardston in 1904 and then died in 1906. But Zina and Charles's son actually was one of the, what is it called, counselors to the temple president, or yeah. So yeah, so they are a big part of the LDS, well, I guess members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints people here. So.
Okay, and how many people live in Cardston today? How big is it?
It's just over 3,000, I think. Okay. So still pretty small, but it's
small town, but a lovely town.
Yes.
Yes. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
One of the most dominant features in Cardston today is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints temple that is here, but it's not something that 3-year-old Fay Wray ever would have seen. This was completed in 1923, so it's having its 100th anniversary this year, in fact. Began construction about 1915, and it was actually the first Mormon temple outside of the United States, built here, built of granite, and just a dominant feature on the landscape against the mountains. In fact, a little bit interesting to see this Old Testament style temple against the backdrop of the Canadian Rocky Mountains. The temple itself built in sort of a range of sort of Art Deco, mission, prairie style. The architects of it were very much influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, and you see that influence inside. Of course, we couldn't take video inside the temple. As it's set aside for sacred purposes in the Mormon Church, you're not allowed to take the photos inside there. But we can see from the outside here what an impressive structure it is. But again, it would have been after Fay Wray's time. And the temple was built because as the Mormons came up north here and spread out, created Cardston and other towns in this area, there were some 7,000 Mormons at the time this temple was built, and that's why they got permission from Salt Lake City to actually build the temple here. So again, one of the major dominant features here, both architecturally, the landscape, and spiritually here in Cardston, Fay Wray's birthplace.
Put your hands together, have some dance in there.
So here at the Cardston Museum in the courthouse, and looking at their folder of Fay Wray stuff, and even just the headlines alone are something. Cardston goes ape for movie star. Kong-sized romance has Alberta roots. Good here. King Kong's girlfriend and return to Cardston. Talking about her visits in 1962 for the 75th anniversary of the town of Cardston, and her return again in 1993 when the Fay Wray Fountain was rededicated. It had been first dedicated in 1962, had fallen into disrepair, and been rededicated in 1993 when she came again. And how about this? Once in a lifetime opportunity, reception and showing of 1933's King Kong with Fay Wray in attendance here in 1993 in Cardston. If I was a King Kong fan when I was like 93, so I would have been like 15, 14, 15. Man, if I knew anything then, I would have totally tugged on my parents' sleeves to take me to see that. Unfortunately, a little bit later, but yeah, Cardston goes ape over Ray's return. Yeah, so a lot of the photos that I've been either have or will be popping up in the video here come from the Cardston Historical Society, Cardston District Historical Society, and this scrapbook that they've put together of Fay Wray, things at her visit, including her visit here to in 1993 when she came back and visited the old homestead that essentially no longer exists. But we're going to go out there. We're going to get as close as we can to the location of the original Wray homestead. So this is about as close as we're probably going to get to the original Wray homestead. It was called Wrayland originally. It is private land today, a grazing lease, and so we couldn't get in touch with the landowner to actually get access. But the original Wrayland homestead would be back in behind those trees over yonder that way. We'll get another vantage point of it as well in sort of our next stop here as well. But this is about as close as we're going to get to it today. And extremely remote, even difficult sort of for us to get to, make sure we're taking the right gravel roads and the township and range roads and that sort of thing. You can just imagine at the time how remote this was for a very, very young Fay and her family. Like many stories of homesteaders out here in southern Alberta on the Canadian prairies, it's a story where, in the summer, the Fay describes her mother talking about the beautiful wildflowers, the beautiful mountains, the beauties here of southern Alberta, here in the foothills. That's Chief Mountain there in the background, Ninastako in traditional Blackfoot Indigenous language, which is actually in Montana. That's how close we are. That mountain's in Montana. The beauty of this landscape here, which I can definitely relate to. I mean, I wouldn't mind being able to retire down here. But then in winter, it's very isolating. You get snowed in and you can't go anywhere. And Fay Wray's mother is not the only woman who is driven mad by the isolation. In fact, the isolation and an incident that happened on a nearby lake also didn't help Fay's mother's mental health very much. But Fay does describe in her book how living out here were also until the mental illness were the happiest days of her parents' lives. They would often, her mother would send out the dog with little notes to father, who was out working in the bush here, trying to make the ranch productive. Sometimes the note was just an "I love you" or something like that. So Fay, she remembers fondly those early days in the bush of her parents' love, and somewhat chillingly later on when that all fell apart after they went to the United States and her parents drifted apart. And then finally when Fay was, her parents just, one day father was no longer there anymore, and Fay was sent off to Hollywood after that. Out here, her father actually had the most success as well. Part of the tension in the marriage was that her father was great at being an entrepreneur, but carrying through to a lasting success was always a difficulty. But out here, he was able to establish a little sawmill and built a lovely little house that I'll post a picture of right here. But a lovely house, lovely veranda, a nice stone gate. And at the foot of that gate was a stone inscribed with the word Rayland. It's what they named their homestead here. And from that, he was the basis for the ranching operation. When Fay returned here in 1962, again for the 75th anniversary of the town of Cardston, she was invited up as a special guest. And she was brought out here by people who remembered exactly where the homestead was, because of course Fay was only 3 when they left. So she didn't have a whole lot of recollection, but luckily other people in the community did, and came out here and actually brought the Rayland stone as well. It would have been nice to be able to get in and go to the actual field what's left there of the homestead. But there's really nothing left there to see. In her book here, Fay describes that there was nothing left. The place had been long since demolished or left to decay or whatever it was, whatever happened to it. But even by like the 1930s, it had already been effectively reclaimed by nature. So there wasn't anything left, but some of the local people brought out the Rayland stone to the site, were able to place it where the homestead was. Now that stone, however, was also given to Fay, who brought it back to California. So even that stone is not left. So there's really nothing out here to show where that homestead actually was, to see any ruins or anything like that. Although it would be nice maybe to erect a little sign or something like that here, saying that the original Wray homestead was out here, the actual birthplace of Fay Wray being out here on this homestead. The weather in southern Alberta is slightly changing.
As one might be able to glean from the how windy it looks here on this lake and on my shirt, that we weren't able to use the audio from this part of the video. But where I'm at right now is at a lake that is the next closest point that you publicly can get to Fay Wray's birthplace. Is right over that hill that I'm pointing at there. Right on the other side of that is the original Wray homestead. And this location is actually one of the earliest memories that Fay describes of the location. So much of her memories are just events around the home and things like that, but this is actually one of her earliest memories of the landscape of southern Alberta. And what she describes in her autobiography, talking about an incident at this lake that negatively affected her mother's health, her mental health. The spring times became winter times. Winter times became bitter times. Snow in 5-foot-high drifts made Mama a prisoner. What had seemed a romantic wonderland because it was 5 miles removed from the nearest post office at Mountain View, and 25 miles from Cardston, the nearest town, became a remote and difficult existence. The last of our winters in Canada, my brother, the eldest child, got pneumonia from a circumstance in which I shared. We were on a sled, I on his big brotherly lap. He would have been 9 or 10. An older boy was pulling us over the icy surface of a lake. We came to a wide crack in the ice. Our friend attempted to yank the sled across the crack. The sled went down into the icy water. I do not remember being frightened or even cold. I just remember seeing my brother's 2 brown shoes sticking up out of the water. I am told he righted himself and held me up until our friend could get us out. That experience was bad for us and for my mother. The temperature dropped that winter to 55 below. Not long after that, she suffered a miscarriage. And then she had a nervous breakdown, which took her away from us and into a hospital for several months. And that is when her family, the children, went to live with various people in Cardston, and she went to live with the Stackpool family. So that's everything I'm talking about here in this little clip of footage here. This incident here at a frozen lake in the isolation of a Canadian prairie winter. And that is just, again, right over that hill over there is where the original Wray homestead was.
Alright, so our day looking for Fay Wray's birthplace ends here at the Prince of Wales Hotel in Waterton Lakes National Park in 1962, when Fay returned to her birth country, her homeland, as it were, for the 75th anniversary of Cardston. She actually stayed here at the Prince of Wales Hotel, which was built in 1927 by Great Northern Railway. Is one of the it's one of the most photographed hotels in North America. But they hosted her at one of the most brilliant and beautiful places in the region. But her family's homestead right here in the foothills of these majestic mountains here in Waterton Lakes National Park, Waterton Glacier International Peace Park, which are some of the most beautiful and oldest rocks in the Canadian Rocky Mountains. And it really was later in her life that Fay actually got an attachment to Canada. She left when she was 3, and again, most of what she inherited were just the memories of her mother and other members of her family, recalling what it was like in Canada. And her mother actually taking great pride in raising her little Canadian wildflowers here in the foothills of the Rockies. But it was later in her life when Fay came back here repeatedly, came back to Cardston, that she actually developed, it seems, at least from her books and interviews and things, that's when she developed more of her attachments to this landscape, which is a wonderful, happy accident for me, as again, as a fan of classical film and Hollywood history, of not really having those connections here, like other YouTubers get to have, or who live in California, live in Los Angeles, and are able to visit all these places. I don't really get to have that, but I do get to have this. I get to have one of the most iconic movie actresses of all time, in one of the most iconic films of all time, and one of my favorite films. who was born just a few hours south of where I live, and being able to visit these places and visit that same landscape that she was born in and that she came to love again later in her life. So thank you for joining me on this little adventure here to visit the birthplace of Fay Wray, and hopefully you found it interesting. And we'll see in the future of what else, what other Hollywood connections might be around here that I get to enjoy, and maybe someday I'll even get to actually visit the actual plot of land. We'll see. But for now, thank you very much for joining me on this adventure.